The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Windsor Castle as security guard James Morrison began his routine patrol. 23 years of service had taught him to notice when something was amiss, and today felt different. The usual quiet dignity of the royal residence seemed disturbed by an undercurrent of tension that made his footsteps echo more loudly than usual. James had always taken pride in his discretion. Working for the royal family meant understanding that some things were meant to remain private, that the walls of these ancient buildings held secrets that would never see daylight. But as he rounded the corner toward the Diana Memorial Wing, he heard sounds that made him pause and strain his ears. The soft thud of something heavy hitting the floor was followed by the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. James quickened his pace, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. The Diana Memorial Wing housed some of the most precious artifacts and portraits commemorating the late Princess of Wales, items that held immense sentimental and historical value. As he approached the main gallery, James could see that the ornate double doors stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, he caught glimpses of movement inside. His training kicked in, and he approached with caution, knowing that any disturbance in this sacred space would be taken very seriously by the royal household. The scene that greeted him when he peered through the doorway left him momentarily speechless. Queen Consort Camilla stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been carefully arranged portraits and memorabilia. Her usually composed demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she appeared to be in the grip of some powerful emotion that had driven her to this destructive act. A large portrait of Diana in her wedding dress lay face down on the Persian carpet, its ornate frame cracked down the middle. Another painting, this one showing Diana with young William and Harry during a family holiday, had been pulled from its mounting and now rested against the wall at an odd angle. Glass from a shattered display case containing Diana's personal letters sparkled across the hardwood floor like scattered diamonds. Camilla seemed oblivious to James's presence as she reached for another portrait. This one showed Diana during her famous visit to the landmine fields of Angola, her face radiant with the compassion that had made her beloved worldwide. James watched in horror as Camilla's hands gripped the frame, her knuckles white with the intensity of her grasp. "Your Majesty," James called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Please step away from the artwork." Camilla spun around, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like relief at being discovered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what James had witnessed hung heavy in the air between them, and both understood that this moment would change everything. "James," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't understand. You can't possibly understand what it's like to live in her shadow, to have every gesture compared to hers, every word measured against her memory." The security guard had seen many things during his years of service, but nothing had prepared him for this raw display of vulnerability from someone who was supposed to embody the dignity and restraint of the royal family. Yet his duty was clear, regardless of his personal feelings about the situation. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to step away from the memorial items," James repeated, his voice steady but firm. "This area is under my protection, and I cannot allow any further damage to occur." Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of someone who had reached their breaking point, who had finally succumbed to pressures that had been building for years. "Protection," she repeated. "Everything in this place is about protecting her memory, isn't it? Even now, 26 years after her death, she's still the perfect princess, the people's princess." As she spoke, Camilla's gaze fell upon a particular portrait that had somehow escaped her earlier rampage. It showed Diana at a charity gala wearing a stunning blue gown, her smile lighting up the entire frame. But what made this portrait particularly significant was the small plaque beneath it, which bore an inscription from William. "To my beloved mother, who taught me that true royalty comes from serving others." Something in Camilla's expression shifted as she read those words. The anger that had driven her to this destructive act seemed to transform into something deeper and more painful. James could see tears forming in her eyes, and for a moment he felt a stab of sympathy for this woman who had never quite managed to win the hearts of the British people. "He still loves her more," Camilla whispered, her voice breaking. "After all these years, after everything I've done to try to be a good stepmother, to support him and Harry, he still sees me as the woman who destroyed his parents' marriage." James knew he should radio for assistance, should report what he was witnessing to his superiors, but something about Camilla's obvious pain made him hesitate. He had children of his own, and he could imagine how difficult it must be to try to fill the shoes of someone who had been elevated to near sainthood in the public consciousness. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "perhaps we should discuss this situation before involving others. The damage here, while significant, could potentially be addressed quietly if we act quickly." But even as he spoke, James knew that the choice was no longer his to make. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, and he recognized the purposeful stride that could only belong to one person. Prince William was coming, drawn perhaps by the unusual activity in this wing of the castle, and James realized that the delicate situation was about to become a royal crisis. Camilla must have heard the footsteps too, because her face went pale, and she stepped back from the portrait she had been holding. The evidence of her actions surrounded them both, impossible to hide or explain away. In a matter of seconds, William would walk through those doors and see the destruction of his mother's memorial, and Camilla would have to face the consequences of allowing her emotions to overcome her judgment. James straightened his shoulders and prepared to face whatever was coming next. His duty was to the crown, but in this moment he found himself hoping that somehow this family could find a way to heal the wounds that had clearly been festering for far too long. The footsteps grew louder, and James could hear voices now, William's distinctive tone mixed with that of his private secretary. In just a few moments, the secret that this room now held would be exposed, and the future of the royal family would be changed forever. As the door handle began to turn, Camilla closed her eyes and drew herself up to her full height, preparing to face the storm that was about to break over all of them. The door swung open with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient castle. Prince William stepped into the Diana Memorial wing, his private secretary Edward trailing behind him, and the sight that greeted them brought an immediate and profound silence to the room. For several long seconds, nobody moved or spoke, as if time itself had frozen to allow the full weight of this moment to settle upon everyone present. William's eyes swept across the devastation with a clinical precision that spoke to his military training. He took in every detail: the shattered glass scattered across the antique carpet, the cracked frame of his mother's wedding portrait lying face down like a fallen soldier, the displaced memorabilia that had been so carefully arranged to honor Diana's memory. His face remained impassive, but James could see the muscles in his jaw tightening with each passing second. "James," William said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone born to command, "please explain what has happened here." The security guard felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon him. In his hand was the power to potentially destroy what remained of the royal family's fragile unity, or to somehow find a diplomatic solution that might preserve everyone's dignity. But as he looked at the man who would one day be king, James knew that anything less than complete honesty would be a betrayal of his oath of service. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I discovered Her Majesty the Queen Consort in this room approximately 10 minutes ago. The damage you see occurred before my arrival." William's gaze shifted to Camilla, who had remained silent throughout this exchange. She stood among the wreckage of Diana's memorial like a defendant awaiting judgment, her earlier vulnerability replaced by a mask of resignation. The woman who had spent decades learning to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol now found herself stripped of all pretense, exposed in her rawest moment. "Camilla," William said, and the absence of any title in his address spoke volumes about the shift that had just occurred in their relationship. "I think you owe me an explanation." For the first time since William's arrival, Camilla raised her eyes to meet his gaze. What James saw in her expression was not defiance or anger, but rather a profound sadness that seemed to have been building for years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated pain and frustration. "Your explanation," she said quietly, "is standing right in front of you, William. Look around this room. Every single day I walk past this shrine to your mother. Every single day I'm reminded that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to be a good wife to your father or a supportive stepmother to you and Harry, I will never measure up to her memory." William's expression didn't change, but James noticed his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. So you decided to destroy it, to tear down the memorial to my mother because you couldn't handle living up to her legacy. Legacy? Camilla's voice rose slightly, and for a moment, the anger that had driven her earlier actions flickered back to life. William, your mother was a remarkable woman, and I would never deny that. But the legend that's been built around her, the impossibly perfect image that everyone expects me to live up to, it's crushing me. Edward, who had been standing silently by the door throughout this exchange, cleared his throat nervously. As William's private secretary, he had witnessed many difficult moments in the royal household. But nothing quite like this. The protocol manuals had no guidance for handling a situation where the Queen Consort had vandalized a memorial to the previous Princess of Wales. Perhaps, Edward ventured carefully, we should discuss how to handle this matter privately, away from— No, William cut him off sharply. This conversation is long overdue, and it's going to happen right here, right now, in front of the damage that's been done. James found himself wishing he could disappear into the walls of the castle. His role as a witness to this family crisis felt increasingly uncomfortable, but he understood that leaving now would be a dereliction of his duty. Whatever happened next, he would need to provide an accurate account to his superiors. Camilla moved closer to the portrait of Diana in the blue gown, the one with William's inscription about true royalty coming from service to others. She stared at it for a long moment before turning back to face her stepson. "Do you want to know what it's really like, William?" she asked. "It's like being married to a ghost. Your father loved your mother, and part of him always will. I accepted that when I married him. But what I didn't anticipate was that I would spend the rest of my life competing with a memory that gets more perfect with each passing year." William's composure finally began to crack, and James could see the emotional toll this confrontation was taking on the future king. "She was my mother," he said, his voice carrying a raw edge that revealed the depth of his pain. "She was taken from me when I was just 15 years old. This memorial isn't about making you feel inadequate. It's about ensuring that her memory and her work continue to inspire future generations." "And what about inspiring confidence in the current generation of royals?" Camilla shot back. "Every time I attend a charity event, every time I try to connect with the public, I can see it in their eyes. They're comparing me to her, and I'm always found wanting." The room fell silent again as both William and Camilla seemed to recognize that they had crossed into territory from which there might be no return. The polite facades that had allowed them to coexist in the same family for years had been stripped away, revealing the genuine hurt and resentment that had been festering beneath the surface. James watched as William walked over to his mother's wedding portrait and carefully lifted it from the floor. The crack in the frame ran diagonally across Diana's face, symbolically dividing the image of the woman who had once been the most photographed person in the world. William's hands trembled slightly as he held the damaged portrait, and when he looked up at Camilla, his eyes were filled with a pain that went beyond mere anger. "This portrait," he said quietly, "was taken on what she later told me was one of the happiest days of her life. She was 20 years old, full of hope and dreams about the future she would build with my father. She had no idea what was waiting for her, no idea that her marriage was already doomed, because Charles couldn't let go of you." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Camilla's face went white, and for a moment, she looked as fragile as the shattered glass that littered the floor around them. "William," she whispered, "you can't blame me for—" "Can't I?" he interrupted, his voice growing stronger and more decisive with each word. "You were there throughout their marriage, Camilla. You were the third person in a relationship that should have been between two people. And now you're here destroying the memorial to the woman whose life you helped to ruin." Edward stepped forward, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond the point of diplomatic resolution. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps we should—" But William held up a hand to stop him. His decision had been made, and James could see in his posture that the future king was about to exercise the full authority of his position. "James," William said, turning to the security guard, "please escort Her Majesty to her private quarters and ensure that she remains there until further notice. Edward, I want you to arrange for immediate repairs to this memorial. Every single item is to be restored exactly as it was." Camilla's eyes widened as the full implications of William's words became clear. "William, you can't be serious. I'm your father's wife. I'm the queen consort. William's expression remained implacable as he delivered what would prove to be the most consequential words of the day. Not anymore. You're not. The words echoed through the Diana Memorial Wing like a royal decree that would reshape the very foundations of the British monarchy. James Morrison felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he realized he was witnessing history in the making, not the kind that would be celebrated in future textbooks, but the kind that would be whispered about in royal circles for generations to come. Camilla stared at William in disbelief, her face cycling through expressions of shock, hurt, and finally a dawning understanding of what his declaration truly meant. "You don't have the authority," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Only the king can." "The king," William interrupted, his tone carrying a finality that made everyone in the room understand that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power within the royal household, "is in Scotland for the next 3 days attending to matters of state. In his absence, I am acting as regent, which gives me full authority to make decisions regarding the security and dignity of the crown." Edward fumbled with his phone, clearly torn between his loyalty to William and his understanding of the constitutional crisis that was unfolding before them. "Your Royal Highness," he said carefully, "perhaps we should contact His Majesty before taking any irreversible actions." William turned to his private secretary with a look that could have frozen the Thames in July. "Edward, are you questioning my judgment in this matter?" "No, sir," Edward replied quickly, "but the ramifications of this decision could be—" "The ramifications," William cut him off, "pale in comparison to allowing someone who would destroy my mother's memory to continue representing the crown. James, please carry out my instructions." James found himself in the most difficult position of his career. On one hand, he had sworn an oath to follow the lawful orders of the royal family. On the other hand, he was being asked to essentially place the queen consort under house arrest based on the authority of a prince who, while next in line to the throne, was not yet king. The legal and constitutional implications were staggering, but as he looked at Camilla standing among the ruins of Diana's memorial, James made his choice. "Yes, Your Royal Highness," he said, moving toward Camilla with the respectful but firm demeanor of someone carrying out an unpleasant duty. Camilla backed away from James, her eyes darting between him and William as if searching for some escape from the impossible situation she now found herself in. "This is madness, William. When your father returns, he'll overturn whatever you think you're accomplishing here. He loves me." "Does he?" William asked, and the quiet devastation in his voice was more powerful than any shouting could have been. "Or does he love the idea of finally being with the woman he couldn't have during his first marriage? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like that woman, the one who helped destroy my parents' relationship and now destroys my mother's memorial, isn't worthy of anyone's love." The cruelty of the statement seemed to physically stagger Camilla. She reached out to steady herself against the wall, and for a moment, James thought she might collapse entirely. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I loved your father for 40 years before I could finally be with him. I've tried so hard to be worthy of the position I've been given, to honor the monarchy and serve the people. But every single day, I'm reminded that I'm not her, that I'll never be her, that everyone wishes she was still here instead of me." William's expression softened slightly, and James could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Despite his anger and grief, the future king was not a cruel man, and Camilla's obvious pain was affecting him. But then his gaze fell again on the damaged portrait of his mother, and his resolve hardened. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're not her, and that's exactly why this had to happen." As James approached Camilla to escort her from the room, she suddenly straightened up, and some of her old dignity reasserted itself. "Before you banish me from this place," she said, looking directly at William, "I want you to understand something. Your mother was indeed a remarkable woman, but she wasn't the saint that everyone has made her out to be. She had her own affairs, her own mistakes, her own moments of weakness. The difference is that her failures have been forgiven or forgotten, while mine are scrutinized and condemned." William's face flushed with anger at this apparent attack on his mother's character. "How dare you?" "I dare because it's the truth," Camilla continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not excusing what I did here today. It was wrong, and I regret it deeply. But I'm tired of being the villain in a story where everyone else gets to be the hero. Your mother struggled with depression, with bulimia, with the pressures of royal life just like I have. The only difference is that when she faltered, the world rallied around her. When I falter, I get exiled." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of Camilla's words. James had heard rumors over the years about Diana's struggles with mental health, but hearing them spoken aloud in this context gave them a different resonance. He could see that William, too, was grappling with the complex reality of his mother's humanity, in contrast to the idealized memory he had preserved. Edward cleared his throat nervously. "Your Royal Highness, if I may, the media will eventually learn about this incident. We need to consider how this situation will be perceived by the public and by the Parliament." William nodded grimly. "You're right, of course. James, before you escort Her Majesty to her quarters, I need to know that I can count on your discretion regarding the details of what happened here today." James straightened to attention. "You have my word, sir, but I should point out that others will need to be informed of the situation. My supervisors, the household staff who will notice Her Majesty's absence from public duties, the restoration specialists who will be needed to repair the damage here. Handle it," William said curtly. "Tell them only what they need to know to do their jobs. As for the public explanation," he paused, clearly struggling with how to present this family crisis to the outside world. "We'll say that Her Majesty is taking a temporary leave of absence for personal reasons." Camilla laughed bitterly. Personal reasons. How delightfully vague. I suppose it sounds better than banished for having a mental breakdown in front of her predecessor's shrine. "Camilla," William said, and this time there was a note of sadness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I want you to know that this decision doesn't bring me any joy. Despite everything that's happened between us, despite the complicated history our families share, I never wanted it to come to this." For a moment, Camilla's angry facade cracked, and James could see the vulnerable woman underneath. "Then don't do it, William. Give me a chance to make this right. Let me restore the memorial myself. Let me prove that I can honor your mother's memory while still serving the crown." William was quiet for a long time, and James could sense the internal battle being waged between the son who wanted justice for his mother and the future king who understood the value of mercy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had cost him dearly. "I'm sorry, Camilla, but some things can't be undone. Some trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt. James, please proceed with the escort." As James gently took Camilla's arm to guide her from the room, she turned back for one last look at William. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become," she said quietly. "But I don't think she would be proud of the choice you're making today." With that, she allowed James to lead her from the Diana Memorial Wing, leaving William alone among the scattered remnants of his mother's memory and the shattered remains of his relationship with his stepmother. The corridor leading to Camilla's private quarters stretched endlessly before James Morrison as he walked alongside the woman who, until an hour ago, had been the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. Their footsteps echoed off the ancient stone walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to mark time like a funeral march. Neither spoke during the long journey through the castle's labyrinthine passages, each lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what had just transpired. As they approached the ornate doors to Camilla's suite, James noticed the subtle changes that had already begun to take place around them. Household staff who normally would have bowed respectfully upon seeing the Queen Consort now averted their eyes, uncertain of the proper protocol for greeting someone whose status had become so dramatically unclear. Word traveled fast within the confines of Windsor Castle, and the news of Camilla's confrontation with William was already spreading through the royal household like wildfire. "James," Camilla said as they reached her door, her voice carrying a weariness that seemed to age her years in the space of minutes. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am," James replied, though he wondered what question could possibly matter in the wake of everything that had happened. "In all your years of service to this family, have you ever seen anything like what just occurred in that memorial wing?" James considered his answer carefully. He had witnessed many things during his tenure as a royal security guard. Family arguments, moments of private grief, instances where the public image of the royals diverged dramatically from their private reality. But nothing had prepared him for the raw destruction of historical artifacts, combined with the swift and decisive action taken by William. "No, ma'am," he said honestly. "I've never seen anything quite like this." Camilla nodded as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. 26 years, she murmured, more to herself than to James. 26 years I'd been part of this family in one capacity or another, and it all ends because I couldn't handle walking past those portraits one more day. As James opened the door to escort Camilla inside, they were greeted by Sarah Mitchell, Camilla's longtime personal secretary. Sarah's face immediately registered confusion at seeing her employer being escorted by security, and her eyes darted between them seeking an explanation for this highly unusual situation. "Sarah," Camilla said with forced normalcy, "I'm going to be staying in my quarters for the next few days. Please cancel all my public engagements and inform the staff that I'm not to be disturbed unless it's a matter of absolute necessity." Sarah's confusion deepened, but her years of service had taught her not to question unusual requests from the royal family. "And certainly, ma'am. May I ask if you're feeling unwell? Should I contact your physician?" Camilla glanced at James, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The fewer people who knew the specific details of what had transpired, the better for everyone involved. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired. Very tired." After Sarah left, promising to handle the cancellations discreetly, James found himself alone with Camilla in the sitting room of her private suite. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the elegant furniture and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. It was a peaceful scene that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil that had brought them to this moment. Camilla moved to the window and gazed out at the grounds of Windsor Castle, her expression distant and contemplative. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to love walking through these gardens with Charles. In the early days of our marriage, we would spend hours out there discussing everything from politics to poetry. He was so happy then, so optimistic about our future together." James remained silent, understanding that Camilla needed to process what had happened, and that sometimes talking helped people make sense of life-altering events. "I suppose I always knew this day would come," she continued. "Not this exactly, but some kind of reckoning. The British people never really accepted me, not the way they accepted Diana. And William, well, William has always been polite, but I could see the reservation in his eyes whenever he looked at me. I represented everything that went wrong in his childhood." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside caused both James and Camilla to turn toward the door. James recognized the heavy tread of Marcus Fleming, the head of royal security, and knew that his superior had come to discuss the unprecedented situation they now faced. A soft knock came at the door, and James opened it to find Marcus standing in the hallway with two other senior members of the security team. Marcus was a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to handling crises, but even he looked somewhat shaken by the events of the afternoon. "James," Marcus said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." James glanced back at Camilla, who nodded her understanding. "Go ahead," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." In the hallway, Marcus quickly briefed James on the immediate fallout from William's decision. "The King's office has been notified of the situation," he said in hushed tones. "His Majesty is returning from Scotland immediately, and should arrive within the next 6 hours. In the meantime, William has assumed full control of the household and has issued specific instructions about how this situation is to be handled." "What are the instructions?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Complete discretion until further notice. No one discusses what happened in that memorial wing with anyone outside of essential security personnel. The restoration team has already been sworn to secrecy, and the official story is that Her Majesty is taking a brief medical leave for stress-related health concerns." James nodded, understanding the delicate balance between truth and public relations that was required in situations like this. "What about when the king returns? Surely he'll want to reverse William's decision." Marcus's expression grew even more grave. "That's where things get complicated. William has documented evidence of what occurred, including your eyewitness testimony and photographs of the damaged memorial. He's also obtained legal opinions from constitutional experts about his authority to act as regent in his father's absence. This isn't just a family dispute anymore, James. This is a constitutional crisis." The full implications of what Marcus was saying began to sink in for James. William hadn't acted impulsively in his anger. He had carefully considered the legal ramifications of his decision and had taken steps to ensure that his authority could not be easily challenged. The future king had played his hand with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "The restoration experts have examined the damaged items in the memorial wing. 3 of the portraits, including the wedding photograph, are beyond repair. They'll need to be completely replaced, which means this incident can't be covered up indefinitely. Eventually, the insurance companies will need to be notified, and that will create a paper trail that could be discovered by the media." James felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated the potential scandal that could erupt if the details of this story ever became public. The image of the queen consort destroying portraits of the beloved Princess Diana would be devastating for the monarchy's reputation, regardless of whatever personal pain might have motivated Camilla's actions. "How long do we have?" James asked. "The insurance claims can probably be delayed for a few weeks, maybe a month if we're lucky. But beyond that," Marcus shrugged helplessly. "William seems to believe that by the time the story inevitably comes out, the situation will have been resolved in a way that protects the integrity of the crown." As James returned to Camilla's sitting room, he found her exactly where he had left her, still gazing out the window at the gardens below. But something in her posture had changed. She seemed to have reached some kind of internal resolution during his brief absence. "James," she said without turning from the window, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened today. You were simply doing your job, and you did it with more compassion than I had any right to expect." "Ma'am," James replied, "if there's anything I can do to help resolve this situation." Camilla turned from the window and looked at him with eyes that seemed both infinitely sad and strangely peaceful. "I'm afraid this situation is beyond resolving, James. What happened today was inevitable. It was just a matter of when and how the reckoning would come." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and James couldn't help but think that they were an appropriate metaphor for what was about to descend upon the royal family when King Charles returned to Windsor Castle. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the evening air announced King Charles's return to Windsor Castle 3 hours ahead of schedule. James Morrison watched from Camilla's window as the royal aircraft descended onto the castle's private helipad, its landing lights piercing the gathering dusk like fallen stars. The king had clearly pushed his travel schedule to its absolute limit, understanding that every minute of delay could allow the crisis to deepen beyond repair. Camilla had spent the afternoon in relative silence, occasionally making quiet phone calls to close friends and family members. James had overheard fragments of these conversations, careful explanations about needing time away from public duties, gentle reassurances that everything would be fine, and what sounded like instructions about personal affairs. It had the quality of someone putting their affairs in order, and that realization made James increasingly uncomfortable about what the evening might bring. "He's here," Camilla said simply, watching the helicopters approach with the calm resignation of someone who had already accepted their fate. Charles never could resist a dramatic entrance. Within minutes, the castle erupted into the controlled chaos that always accompanied the unexpected arrival of the monarch. James could hear the rapid footsteps of staff members hurrying through the corridors, the brief burst of radio communications coordinating security protocols, and the general sense of urgency that permeated the ancient walls whenever major events were unfolding. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the relative tranquility of Camilla's quarters. James opened it to find Edward, still carrying himself with the harried efficiency of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. "His Majesty requests the immediate presence of all parties involved in today's incident in the blue drawing room," Edward announced formally. "This includes you as well, James. Your testimony will be required." Camilla rose from her chair with the dignity that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. She smoothed her clothes and checked her appearance in the mirror, every movement deliberate and controlled. "Well," she said with a wry smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I suppose it's time to face the music." The blue drawing room was one of Windsor Castle's most formal spaces, typically reserved for state occasions and important diplomatic meetings. The choice of venue sent a clear message about the gravity of the situation and the official nature of whatever proceedings were about to unfold. As James escorted Camilla through the corridors, they passed various members of the royal household staff, all of whom maintained careful, neutral expressions, while their eyes betrayed intense curiosity about the unfolding drama. When they arrived at the blue drawing room, they found King Charles standing near the fireplace, still wearing his traveling clothes and bearing the unmistakable signs of stress and fatigue. William stood on the opposite side of the room, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. The tension between father and son was immediately palpable, filling the elegant space with an electrical charge that made everyone else in the room deeply uncomfortable. "Camilla," Charles said as she entered, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and anguish. "Thank God you're safe. When I received William's message about what had happened, I feared the worst." For a moment, Camilla's composure wavered, and James could see the pain that Charles's obvious concern caused her. She had spent the afternoon preparing herself for anger, for recrimination, for the kind of cold royal displeasure that could freeze the blood in one's veins. His immediate worry for her well-being seemed to catch her completely off guard. "Charles," she began, but her voice failed her, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. The pressure, the constant comparisons, the feeling that I could never measure up, it all just became too much." Charles moved toward her instinctively, his face softening with the kind of compassion that had always been one of his most admirable qualities. But William's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Father, before you say anything else, you need to understand the full scope of what happened today. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. Camilla deliberately destroyed irreplaceable historical artifacts in the memorial dedicated to my mother. The damage is extensive and, in some cases, permanent." Charles stopped in his tracks, his expression shifting from concern to confusion to dawning horror as the implications of William's words sank in. "Surely you're exaggerating. Camilla would never—" "James was there, Father. He witnessed everything. Perhaps he should provide his account of what he saw." All eyes turned to James, who found himself once again in the impossible position of having to navigate between competing loyalties and conflicting versions of truth. He had been a security guard for over 2 decades, but nothing in his training had prepared him for being the key witness in what amounted to a trial of the Queen Consort. "Your Majesty," James began, addressing Charles directly, "I discovered Her Majesty in the Diana Memorial Wing at approximately 2:30 this afternoon. Several portraits had been removed from their mountings and damaged. Display cases had been disturbed, and there was broken glass on the floor. Her Majesty appeared to be in considerable emotional distress." Charles looked as though he had been physically struck. "Camilla, is this true?" "Yes," Camilla replied quietly, meeting her husband's gaze with painful honesty. "It's true. Every word of it." The silence that followed was profound and devastating. James watched as Charles seemed to age years in the space of moments, the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The king who had waited decades to marry the woman he loved was now confronted with the reality that their union might have cost him his relationship with his eldest son and the respect of the institution he was sworn to protect. "Why?" Charles asked finally, the single word carrying more pain than any longer speech could have conveyed. "Because I'm tired, Charles. I'm tired of being the villain in everyone else's story. I'm tired of walking past that memorial every day and being reminded that your first wife will always be more beloved than your second. I'm tired of seeing the disappointment in William's eyes every time he looks at me, knowing that he wishes she was still here instead of me." William stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had already made up his mind about what needed to happen next. "Father, I've made a decision about this situation. Camilla can no longer represent the crown in any official capacity. The damage to the memorial, combined with the underlying issues that led to this incident, make it impossible for her to continue as queen consort." "William," Charles said sharply, "you don't have the authority to make that decision." "Actually, Father, I do. I've consulted with constitutional experts, and as regent in your absence, I have the power to take immediate action to protect the integrity of the monarchy. The documentation is already in place." Charles stared at his son with an expression that combined shock, anger, and something that looked almost like pride at William's decisive action, even as it tore his personal world apart. "You would destroy my marriage to protect your mother's memory? I would protect the crown from scandal, and the British people from having to watch their queen consort destroy monuments to the woman they still consider the true people's princess." The room fell silent as father and son faced off across the elegant space, their conflict representing not just a personal family dispute but a fundamental disagreement about the nature of duty, forgiveness, and the future direction of the monarchy. Camilla, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Charles, William is right." Both men turned to stare at her in surprise. "This marriage has cost us all too much," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It cost you your relationship with your sons. It cost me the respect of the British people, and it cost the monarchy years of stability and public trust. Perhaps it's time to finally pay the full price for the choices we made all those years ago." Charles reached for her hand desperately. "Camilla, we can work through this. We can repair the damage, rebuild the trust." "No, my darling," she said gently, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Some things can't be repaired. Some trust, once broken, can never be rebuilt. William understands that better than either of us." As the reality of what was happening settled over the room, James realized he was witnessing the end of one of the most controversial love stories in royal history. The woman who had waited 40 years to marry the man she loved was now voluntarily walking away from him to save the institution they both had sworn to serve. Outside, the storm that had been gathering all afternoon finally broke, sending rain lashing against the windows of Windsor Castle as the royal family faced the consequences of choices made decades earlier in a different world, when they were all younger and believed that love could conquer any obstacle.